Hi, I'm Kendall. Welcome back to our series comparing seed starting mix with potting mix and talking about which one makes more sense to use when starting seeds. So in the first video, we reviewed 17 channels that thought seed starting mix was the best. And now we are going to talk about 17 more channels that think potting mix is the best. I did not select these channels based on whether or not they thought seed starting or potting mix was the best. I honestly just ended up with really balanced results. So this isn't the most scientific study or comparison, but I did think it was interesting that we basically ended up with a 50-50 mix of half people recommending seed starting mix pretty strictly and half people recommending potting mix maybe a little less strictly. And we'll start with some of those that recommend potting mix but also say seed starting mix is fine. So we're going to start with Kevin and Jacques over at Epic Gardening. I went ahead and bunched them into one, even though I know Jacques has his own separate channel, because they recently did a Q&A video on Epic Gardening and Kevin mentioned Jacques' seed starting method and it seems to have his approval. So I'm going to go ahead and say that they're on the same page as far as using sifted potting mix to start their seeds, since he said it was a good idea and he liked the way that Jacques was doing it. Now he does historically have videos using especially a spoma. He has a video from I think about 3 years ago calling it his new favorite seed starting method. He has his specific Epic Gardening trays that he's using, and in that video it's sponsored by a spoma and he's using seed starting mix from a spoma. Now I found it hard to tell sometimes when people are sponsored whether or not that's actually what they think. And so because that was an Espoma sponsored video where he was advertising using that seed starting mix, I actually am giving that a little less credit than the most recent unsponsored video where he's talking about Jacques' method of starting seeds in potting soil, just because I feel like that's closer to what he thinks right now, what he's more likely using right now. And it doesn't seem to be as impacted by sponsorships than maybe those previous videos. So we're going to put Kevin and Jacques in the sifted Fox Farms potting soil camp. They are also in the camp, both of them, of hydrating their mix after they put seeds in it. So I find this very strange because I do think that the soil settles a lot after you add water to it. But I also think that when you're using a potting mix, there is less soil settling and less moving around of particles than there is with seed starting mix. And that's because potting mix has more compost in it and things like composted forest products or wood pieces in it that I think keep the mixture fluffier over time. And potting mixes tend to come with more moisture in them already than seed starting mixes. If you compare bags of seed starting mix and potting mix in the store, frequently the seed starting mix can have no holes or ventilation in them because it's a sterile medium with most of the water removed. So there's no decomposition happening in that bag that would require a need for a hole or ventilation, versus potting mixes that have composted manure, other types of compost, worm castings, bat guano, all the things that they add to these mixes. A lot of times they'll put holes in those bags because they need to vent. Otherwise the bags would fill with gases from that composting process, right? And so you're more likely, because of those holes, to be getting a potting mix that already has some hydration in it. And so in a way, you're kind of using a mix that is a little bit pre-moistened, even if you're not saying that that's what you're doing. So that's my theory about why more of the people in this potting mix category don't pre-moisten their soil versus those in the seed starting mix category who almost all of them pre-moisten their soil. Hi, Editing Kendall here. I just got back from the Northwest Flower and Garden Festival where I got a chance to talk to Kevin and Jacques about seed starting soil and pre-moistening because I'm a big nerd and that's what you do at garden festivals, right? So they were super nice to answer my questions. I brought up the sort of hydrophobic soil seed starting mix versus potting mix thing. And they did did confirm that they agree with what I just talked about, which is if the soil is hydrophobic and super dry and dusty, you do need to pre-moisten it before you add your seeds. A lot of times the soil they're using on their channel, like the Fox Farms sifted potting soil, already has some moisture in it. Jacques even said sometimes he does pre-moisten. So basically he's just feeling the texture of that soil when he's sifting it, mixing it, and then adding it to the containers and deciding as a professional, right, whether or not it needs a little bit more moisture before he puts the seeds in so that the soil doesn't settle too much and that sort of thing. So they always water it in afterwards, but are just really feeling the soil and the moisture of it when they're adding it to their containers to decide if they need to add it at the beginning or not. So that's going to be a big difference between using seed starting mix that is really just like dried peat moss or compressed coconut coir or some of those things that really need moisture to even be usable, and then something like a potting mix where there's a huge variability on how much moisture that potting mix is coming with in the first place. So I just wanted to add that quick note that I did confirm with them that they agree that you as the seed starter need to check the moisture level of the medium you're using, and that's how you decide whether or not it needs to be pre-moistened. Next up, we have James from James Prigioni's The Gardening channel. I went ahead and put him up next because he also likes to use Fox Farms sifted potting soil, just like Jacques. But in some other older videos, he talks about using seed starting mix or making your own mix with an emphasis on texture, having a light, fluffy texture for planting your seeds. And so both epicgardening and James Prigioni, which are some of the biggest gardening channels on YouTube, are using sifted potting soil in their own seed starting, but in other videos on their channel, they also recommend seed starting mix. I went ahead and put them in this category because they're actively using sifted potting soil, but I did think it was interesting that they don't have any problem with you using seed starting mix. It doesn't seem like they're using the potting mix because it's better in some way. It's just what they have on hand and what they like to use in their potting situation. You can also consider that these YouTubers are probably producing a lot more things from seed than maybe you are in your small growing situation. And so they might just have more potting compost on hand because across the season, you're going to need more potting mix than you're going to need seed starting mix. Just for this small period of time here between February, March, April seed starting season, you'll use some seed starting mix, but you'll need much smaller quantities of it for your smaller trays for starting all these little seedlings than you are going to be for these bigger containers to fill with potting mix. So they could be also choosing it because of a convenience factor because they already have the other stuff on hand. They care about the texture of it, so they are sifting it. Both Jacques and James sift their soil to get all the big wood pieces out of it or chunks of compost or other things that are in there. So the seed isn't sitting on a piece of wood and not germinating. So they're emphasizing texture, but they seem to not care how much nutrition is in that soil or not. And they seem to not care whether or not it is sterile. And so another thing I want to point out about a lot of these YouTubers who are using potting mix instead of seed starting mix, many of them have greenhouses and do a lot of seed starting in their greenhouses. A lot fewer YouTubers in the seed starting category had greenhouses, or if they did, they also have indoor grow spaces. So like Laura from Garden Answer, she has an indoor seed starting room and she has a few outdoor greenhouses, right? Eli from Eli and Kate, she has a greenhouse, but she also starts seeds in her wife's office along the side. So she doesn't want bugs or anything smelly growing in the corner of her wife's office inside, right? And same with Janie from Dig Plant Water Repeat. Even though she has a greenhouse, she has an indoor studio where she's starting a lot of these seeds before she moves them outside. So a lot of those seed starting mix people want sterile mixes because it's in their basement, in their home where they're starting these seeds. They don't want anything growing or flying around in them. Kevin and Jacques both have greenhouses, and James Prigioni has a greenhouse where they're starting a lot of their seeds. I'm not sure, maybe they have basement grow rooms too, but it does give them more flexibility to be accepting of any sort of soil life or smells or bugs It's easier to tolerate in a greenhouse, and in fact, you can't even stop it from coming in when you have a greenhouse. So you sort of have a different mentality about soil life and insects in the greenhouse world than you do when you're growing something in your home in the basement. So a lot of the people in this category of using potting mix have this outdoor grow situation that they have access to. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're deciding which medium to use. If you're growing things in your basement or in your dining room, it seems like a lot of people grow seeds in their dining room, you might want to use something that's sterile and less likely to have fungus gnat eggs in it or mold spores or other fungus in it. That might become more of a priority for you. But if you're growing most things outside, maybe it just doesn't matter as much. That leads us to the next person, who is Jess from Roots and Refuge. She also has a large YouTube channel, and she has a video specifically talking about seed starting mix versus potting mix. Again, I'm going to put all these links below to videos that I think kind of best represent for these channels their opinions on seed starting versus potting mix. Again, she has a big greenhouse. She grows a lot in there, but she shows us Jiffy in that episode. She said it's fine to use Jiffy. She just doesn't prefer that. She shows us the soil she prefers, something called Bacto that she gets from Wilco. And she mentions that it might not be sterile and things like that. But again, pros and cons. She's choosing what makes most sense for her to have on hand and what has worked for her in the past. One more person who's kind of in this transition from seed starting to potting soil is Lars from the Perennial Garden. He has previous videos in which he said to use seed starting mix, and he did use seed starting mix, but in some of his newer videos, he is now using a potting soil. He specifically talks about using one for tomatoes for some reason. I don't know if it's low fertility or what's in that. He said he likes the texture of it, and specifically mentions that seed starting mix is too expensive. So that's going to be a theme with some of these other channels, is that they are choosing to use things besides pre-bagged seed starting mix because they think that those companies are charging way too much money for what is actually in those bags. But that's the same reason that some of our seed starting mix people make their own mixes, right? You can buy a big bale of peat, or you can buy some compressed bricks of coconut coir and a bag of vermiculite and make your own seed starting mix really easily. So you can make the budget argument from either side. Vita Loca from Budget Gardening uses seed starting mix for a budget reason, and Lars uses potting mix for a budget reason, and that could be a location thing too. In his area, he is able to find a certain product for a certain price, and that works for him. A lot of gardeners, they find something that works for them in their region and they stick with it. So speaking of things being different overseas, we do know that seed starting compost or seed starting mix exists in England, especially peat-free versions, because they're really big on the peat-free in England. Nonetheless, many of the English gardeners who I found on YouTube are using potting mix or potting compost. The first one is Charles Dowding. Now, to start his seeds, he mostly seems to use his own homemade hot compost. So we talked about in the previous video how Jim Putnam would like to use hot compost for his seed starting. Maybe this is where he gets some of those ideas. Charles Dowding seems to have a lot of success with using his own compost. He does do a lot of trials of other potting soils on his channel. I'm not sure how much seed starting soils he has tested. He notes that it's hard to pick a bagged potting mix and have it be consistent across years. I think that's happening because he's picking mixes that do have compost in them, and compost is variable, right? If you're using food scraps that are breaking down, the content of that is going to be variable depending on what state of decomposition that compost is in. The texture is going to be variable. The available nutrition in that soil is going to be variable. So I think he could be struggling with consistent potting mixes because he is using potting mixes and not seed starting mixes. I think if you're using a seed starting mix, like a bagged Jiffy mix, because there are so few ingredients in there, and the ingredients that are in there are a lot more consistent across time. You're using mostly dried peat and dried vermiculite, maybe some perlite, maybe some lime. Those materials are all easier to keep consistent in measurement and consistency over time than any material that has decomposing forest products. The amount of leaves versus wood in there could be different over time. The state of decomposition could be different. The types of things that were composted could be different. So I think that's why it's hard to get consistent compost, and potting soil has a lot of compost in it over time. So all that to say, Charles Dowding mostly uses his own hot compost in his own garden. Now, using your own compost, you can really control what's in there. You can make sure there are no allelochemicals in there that you don't want, like black walnut, or there's another list of things if you want to go look into that. I think it's probably better to use your own hot compost than it is to use other people's compost, so you can control what's in there and make sure that it's safe for seed starting. The next English YouTuber is HuwRichards. He does a lot of veggie gardening, has done videos forever on YouTube about gardening, and his most recent videos, he seems to be using an unsifted potting compost. So again, this is a potting soil. In some of his previous videos, he did sift his compost. So he, like a lot of others, has changed over time. I'm guessing because he's producing things on a bigger scale, it's easier for him to just start seeds in a compost or in a potting mix that he can use for a lot of other things as well. And he's in a greenhouse in most of the recent situations. I've seen him starting seed starting mix. And so maybe he's not quite as worried about pests or mold or things in that situation. And then lastly, we have Ben from GrowVeg. He mostly grows vegetables and he's big on the sifting. So he sifts his potting mix and he has some great advice about starting seeds and using what you have available to you. He likes to reuse 3-inch pots and sort of broadcast sow or sprinkle the seeds on there and then pot them from that one 3-inch pot into a bunch of other 3-inch pots, which I think is a fun strategy for seed starting. So that is Ben from GrowVeg. And that is our European crowd. Next, we have Roxana from SoilandMargaritas. She is really consistent using an unsifted burpee potting mix. I think she is an example of somebody just finding a brand that really works for them and that is consistent over time and just sticking with that brand. So she can get the burpee mix in a really accessible size bag. They seem to do a good job keeping a consistent texture. I think it tends to be a drier mix. And so she's not struggling with pests or anything in her indoor seed starting space. And she's making soil blocks for some of her seed starting. And so I think having the potting mix makes it so that her soil blocks are sticking together a little bit better. Hi, Editing Kendall here. I just wanted to make a quick note that when I was looking for video to show you of Roxana using the burpee potty mix, I actually found another video that she just made saying she is switching her brand from burpees to something else. So I know I just said she was super consistent. She said she's been using that burpees potting mix for 6 years and really liked it, but her local place stopped carrying it, and so she decided to experiment with some other things. She tried 4 different options. Burpee ended up being the worst, and she has switched over to a brand called Fort V, and it is also a compost-based potting mix. So she did stick with a potting mix, but now she is sifting it. She said she bought a sifter from Amazon, so I'll link to that video below if you want to see her reasoning behind switching brands and things like that. So she's still here in the potting mix category, but she has now switched from burpee over to a sifted Fort V potting mix for seed starting. Next up, we have Robert from Garden Fundamentals. He has a garden science-y channel where he's been gardening forever and likes to dig into the reasons that he does certain things, and he has sort of some older school methods of doing things, but he uses ProMix. He doesn't talk a lot about what kind of ProMix, but I think it's the general purpose or multi-purpose ProMix that a couple other people who we're going to talk about next also use. I didn't see him really talk about sifting or anything, and he doesn't really seem to be consistent about pre-moistening his soil or not. Joe Lample from joegardenerTV is also a ProMix guy, although the most recent video I could find of him making seeds, he was mixing ProMix with worm castings. We talked a little bit in the previous video about why maybe not to use worm castings, but I have not purchased Joe's seed starting course that he sells, so I would be curious if any of you have bought that course, if he is using ProMix and worm castings for seed starting in that course, the same that he's using on his videos that he has available on YouTube. So as far as I can tell, he uses a bag ProMix and then mixes worm castings in there to start his seeds. One more person that uses ProMix is Crane from cranerygardens. He just did a really fun recent episode about ways to start seeds that he hates and one that he likes. So I recommend checking that out. And he's not real clear in that video about what soil mix he's using, but I really liked that video. So I dug back a little bit into his other videos, and he shows a big white bag of ProMix that's the same as the one that Joe and Robert are using. So I'm assuming that he uses that for a lot of other things too. One of the seed starting methods that Crane uses is soil blocking. So I think that ProMix bag probably works better for soil blocking than seed starting mix. That could be a reason that he's choosing to use that. Hi, I'm back again. So when I was looking for images of ProMix to share with you, I found out the ingredients of ProMix. I must have read it before, but it just didn't occur to me that it doesn't have any sort of compost or fertilizer in there. It really sounds like, I'm talking about this white ProMix bag, ProMix BX Mycorrhizae. That seems to be the one I'm seeing in the background of most YouTube videos of YouTubers using ProMix. The ingredients of that mix are peat, perlite, vermiculite, dolomitic lime, wetting agent, and mycorrhizae. So it sounds a lot like Espoma or some of these other seed starting mixes that we've been talking about, because it doesn't contain any fertilizer or compost. And weirdly enough, their seed starting mix has organic fertilizer in it. Now that does make me think, I know we haven't talked about Luke from MIgardener yet. He's going to be our very last 35th YouTuber that we're going to talk about at the end. And I kind of give him a hard time about adding fertilizer to his mix. But now that I see the ingredients of ProMix and that they're kind of doing some opposite things from what I thought seed starting and potting mix contains, it could explain a little bit about why Luke from MIgardener is making the choices he's making. He is wanting to use an inert media, which is what ProMix is, meaning it doesn't have like a lot of life in it, like bacteria and fungus and things like that. But then he's adding fertilizer. So if he's trying to imitate a ProMix or create his own ProMix at home, that could be why his seed starting mix contains fertilizer. So we'll talk more about Luke later. In the meantime, let's visit some YouTubers who are using potting mix to start their seeds using soil blocks. Next up, we enter a little bit more of the soil blocking world with Bree from Blossomandbranch. Bree is really big on sustainability, low plastics, environmentally friendly materials. She wants to use a peat-free potting mix. So she makes her own peat-free mix. She also talks about using Fox Farms potting mix. I'm guessing they have a peat-free version. I'll have to look into that. But she does a lot of soil blocking, especially starting with those little teeny tiny soil blocks in her basement and in a greenhouse. So she has a peat-free homemade recipe for you to use, and she updates that a lot. She has an updated one this year and is constantly testing soil textures and what works best for her. And then she says her backup one is Fox Farms if you just want to buy a bagged mix. So that was Bree from Blossomandbranch. Next up, we have Lisa from TheGardenersWorkshop. Lisa is the cool flowers lady. So a lot of what she's doing is starting flowers early and getting them out when it's still cool to get a longer growing season on certain flower varieties. She tends to use a homemade mix. She's also doing a lot of soil blocking, and her mix contains compost. And so I find her to be right in this potting mix category. She has recipes for you, and she even sells on her website a bag of mix to add to your compost and your cocoa coir or peat. That's the other part of the mix. And I think it's rock phosphate and something else in this bag. So she has a lot of great resources, and especially if you're starting cool flowers or if you're doing teeny tiny soil blocks, she has great material to check out about how to use that stuff. The last person I'm going to talk about who uses some soil blocking is Jesse from notillgrowers. He uses a bagged mix called Tilth. I think that's a local bagged mix. So he both makes soil blocks and then also recommends the Charles Dowding trays that came out a couple years ago. So even though Tilth has something that's called a seed starting and potting mix, the ingredients of it are: the first ingredient is living compost, then peat moss, perlite, gypsum, blood meal, bone meal, sand, rock dust, biochar, and kelp meal. So because it has so much nutrition and compost in it, even though the label says seed starting, kind of like the Coast of Maine product I talked about earlier, it's closer to a potting mix. So in this case, I'm going to put him in the potting mix category with that tilth soil. So that was Jesse from notillgrowers. Next we have one more international channel, just because it has so many followers, is Mohit from Urban Gardening. And he is the only person I could find who's actually recommending using soil from the ground. So Mohit, like a couple of the people at the beginning of this video, says use a seed starting mix if you want, or use, and then he proceeds to use his own mix that contains garden soil. So he's actually taking soil out of the ground and then mixing it with things like coconut coir, sand, vermiculite, other things like that. So I found that very interesting because nobody else was recommending starting seeds in soil from the ground. There's a lot of reasons you don't want to start seeds in soil that you're digging up from your yard, a lot of which we've already talked about. Pathogens, other seeds could be in it that you don't want, like weed seeds. There could be other allelochemicals in it. It could have a lot of wood products or other decomposing products in it that you don't want. It could have a high amount of clay or something that's not ideal for seed starting. So there's a lot of reasons not to use garden soil. That said, people directly sow seeds in their yard, right? So it's not that you can't do it, but it was just surprising that he was using soil from the ground. Nobody else was doing that. So that was Mohit from Urban Garden, very different from a lot of the other recommendations. And then we only have two more. The second to last is Jordan from MindandSoil. He does a lot of garden experiments and he just released one, so I wanted to include it, where he is testing growing things in compost versus in seed starting mix, or a combination of compost and seed starting mix. I think he said he's going to release that official video soon, but he already released one showing a difference between two lettuces, one grown in 100% compost and one grown in a mix. And his recommendation right now is 1 part compost to 2 parts of seed starting mix, basically making his own potting mix combination for seed starting. So I thought that was interesting. He had a couple reflections about why 100% compost isn't great. So just like Ashley from Gardening in Canada talked about how 100% worm castings wasn't great, Jordan talks about how compost is heavier and denser, harder for the new baby roots to get down into it, also holds too much water, can attract more fungus, and can contribute to things like dampening off, which is very bad for seedlings. And now last but not least, I saved Luke from MIgardener because he does something unique that nobody else is doing, and that is literally adding fertilizer to his seed starting soil. So kind of no judgment in a way, but I have to judge because it's the video I'm making right now. So Luke's been doing this a lot longer than I have. I'm sure he has his reasons for doing that. So I'm trying to say this in a nice way without being too suspicious, but he is selling the fertilizer that he's recommending that you put into the seed starting mix, right? And so like we've learned from the 34 people previous to this that you don't need any nutrition in your seed starting mix. I mean, some people are adding worm castings and think that you kind of need some nutrition, but in order to germinate seeds and take them from dormancy to a baby seedling, you do not need nutrition. That seed has everything it needs in it. So the only reason to put any sort of nutrition in the soil is for once it starts growing its true leaves and needs more nutrition from the environment so that it's there and ready for it. And I think that's Luke's argument about why to put the fertilizer in the soil. But I just think it's risky, and I'm not sure why you would add fertilizer when you don't need to. Maybe if you're growing a seedling in a larger pot and you're not going to pot it up and it's going to need that nutrition, you could do that. Or you can just fertilize it later once it's grown, into a seedling. So I'm kind of suspicious of actually adding fertilizer to your seed starting mix. After watching all these other videos, I would say don't do it. It's unnecessary. But also Luke has a ton of experience here. So if he wants to come out with more videos explaining why why fertilizer in your seed starting mix, I would be totally curious to know more details about why. But especially if you are starting seeds in a small container, a small cell, or if you're starting them in a tray and then you're going to prick them out in a small stage and put them in a container with potting mix, you don't need your seed starting mix to have fertilizer or anything in it. It just needs to be a light, fluffy medium that can hold just the right amount of moisture to germinate that seedling. So Luke from MIgardener is in the potting mix category. He makes his own homemade mix that contains fertilization and fertilizer in it. So he gets to live in the potting mix category for starting seedlings. And I'd be curious if any of you have used his fertilizer to start your seedlings, if you've noticed a difference. There is a lot of room for argumentation about this, right? Like there's a lot of room to say, well, I've used this forever and it works just fine, and I've used this forever and that works fine. And fine, if you've found something that works for you and you get enough germination that you're happy with it, that's great, right? I thought it was interesting to think about all these different variables that other YouTube gardeners are considering when they're choosing what medium to use to start their seeds. And if you're a newer gardener or you just haven't thought about seed starting that much, maybe you haven't thought about all these variables yet. So I'm just trying to give you some more information so you can think about all the variables in your own environment and all the pros and cons of using different types of seed starting media, so you can decide what's the best fit for you. And maybe you do something this year, maybe you do something next year that's different. Maybe you do one group of seed starts now and then you try something else. And maybe you just find a local potting mix like several of these people have that works really well for you, and so you just stick with that because it just works really well. Hopefully there's not too much arguing in the comment section about what's the best way, but I think the conclusion from this video might actually be, since it's 50-50 and some people just use whatever they have on hand, or they say either one works, it's really about just understanding better how seeds start and why you might use one or the other, and how you can best set up a seed starting environment with all the factors you need to successfully start your seeds and to get high germination so you're not wasting your money or your time. So that was a ton of information, and I know some of it's going to be controversial, but I'd love to hear about what you're using to start your seeds. If there's something you learned that you hadn't heard before about seed starting. I have to tell you, after doing all this research, I have found a potting mix that I like that tends to be very dry and compacted when I buy it. I've never had any trouble with bugs in it. It does have big pieces of wood, and so I now sift it and I pre-moisten it because it does have peat in it. But I've found my own combination of things that work for me based on resources I have available to me. So I will do a future video about specifically my own seed starting setup, but I've taken a lot of what I've learned from all of these YouTubers and applied it to my own situation and decided whether or not I'm using seed starting mix or potting mix. And now that I know all those variables and considerations when I'm starting my seeds. No matter if you choose seed starting mix or potting mix, you are focusing on good seed germination, and there's 4 factors for seed germination that I talk about in this video. So I will link to my should you pre-moisten your soil or not video here in case you haven't watched that yet. That will go through those 4 factors of seed germination you should be considering, and that might help you decide which seed starting medium is best for you. Thanks for joining me. I hope to see you again in the next video soon. Bye.